Hey everyone, welcome back to our English practice session. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to dive into a story about life, unexpected turns, and the beauty of the American outdoors. This is perfect for practicing your listening and speaking skills because we'll be using real-world, everyday American English. So, grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Chapter 1. The Monday Morning Blur. It was a typical Monday morning in New York City. The sun was just starting to peek through the skyscrapers, and the sound of distant honking was already filling the air. Mark sat at his kitchen island, staring at his lukewarm coffee. He had a stable job in marketing, a nice apartment in Brooklyn, and a routine that never changed. But as he looked at the spreadsheet on his laptop, he felt a strange sense of restlessness. Is this it? He whispered to himself. He needed a break, not just a weekend away, but a real escape. Chapter 2. The Decision. Mark reached for his phone and called his best friend, Sarah. Sarah was a freelance photographer who lived for adventure. Hey, Sarah, Mark said, his voice sounding more certain than he felt. Pack a bag. We're leaving. Leaving. It's 8 a.m. on a Monday, Mark. Where are we going? Sarah laughed, but she sounded intrigued. West, Mark replied. I've always wanted to see the Grand Canyon, and I'm tired of waiting for the right time. Let's just go. By noon, Mark had taken a week off work, and they were hitting the interstate in his old, reliable SUV. The city skyline began to fade in the rearview mirror, replaced by the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. Chapter 3. The Open Road. Driving across the United States is a rite of passage. For Mark and Sarah, it was a chance to reconnect with the world outside of a screen. They stopped at small-town diners where the waitresses called everyone, honey, and served the best blueberry pie Mark had ever tasted. They talked about everything, their dreams, their fears, and what they wanted for the future. As they crossed into the Midwest, the landscape flattened out, revealing endless fields of corn under a massive, blue sky. You know, Sarah said, leaning her head against the window, we spend so much time worrying about the destination that we forget to enjoy the drive. Chapter 4. A Turn of Events. Just as they were crossing the border into Colorado, the SUV made a strange sputtering noise. Mark's heart sank. He pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, miles away from the nearest town. Great, Mark sighed, gripping the steering wheel. Just great. They stepped out of the car, and the silence of the high plains was deafening. But as Mark looked up, he saw something he hadn't seen in years, the Milky Way. Without the city lights, the stars were so bright they almost looked like they were glowing. Well, Sarah said, pulling her camera out of her bag. I guess we're staying here for a while. Might as well make it a photo shoot. Chapter 5. The Midnight Mechanic. They had been sitting on the hood of the car for about an hour, sharing a bag of beef jerky and watching the satellites drift across the sky, when two bright headlights appeared in the distance. A dusty pickup truck pulled up behind them with a low rumble. A man stepped out, wearing a worn-out baseball cap and a flannel shirt. You folks looks like you're a long way from home, he said with a friendly, slow-paced Western drawl. Need a hand? Mark wiped his hands on his jeans. Yeah, she just quit on us. We're headed toward the canyon. The man, whose name was Jim, popped the hood and took a look. After a few minutes of poking around with a flashlight, he chuckled. Just a loose battery terminal and a clogged air filter. I've got the tools in the back. Within 20 minutes, the SUV roared back to life. Mark tried to offer him some cash, but Jim just waved it off. Just pay it forward when you see someone else in a pinch. Welcome to Colorado. Chapter 6. Into the Red Rocks. The next morning, the air turned crisp and thin as they climbed into the Rockies. The lush green trees of the east were long gone, replaced by jagged peaks and deep red canyons. Check that out, Sarah shouted, pointing toward a trailhead near Moab, Utah. They decided to pull over for a quick hike. The ground was made of fine, orange sand that got into their boots, but the view from the top was breathtaking. Giant stone arches stood like natural monuments against the turquoise sky. As Mark stood on the edge of a plateau, he felt the stress of his Brooklyn office finally melt away. He realized that the right time he had been waiting for wasn't a date on a calendar, it was a mindset. Chapter 7. The Grand Finale. 3 days after leaving the city, they finally reached the south rim of the Grand Canyon just as the sun was beginning to set. They walked to the edge of the lookout, and for the first time in his life, Mark was completely speechless. The canyon stretched out for miles, a sea of purple, orange, and gold shadows. It was so big it didn't even look real. Sarah, Mark said, his voice quiet. I think I'm going to quit my job. Sarah didn't look surprised. She just kept clicking her camera. I figured. So, what's the new plan? I don't know yet, Mark laughed, feeling a rush of genuine excitement. But I think I'd rather figure it out on the road than behind a desk. Chapter 8. A New Perspective. That night, they stayed in a small wooden cabin nearby. Instead of checking his emails, Mark sat on the porch and wrote in a notebook. He realized that this trip wasn't just about seeing the sights, it was about reclaiming his time. The next morning, they woke up early to catch the sunrise. The air was freezing, and their breath came out in little white clouds. As the first ray of light hit the canyon floor, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known since he was a kid. Ready to head back? Sarah asked, jangling the car keys. Mark looked at the map, then looked at the long, winding road stretching further west toward the Pacific Ocean. Not yet, he smiled. Let's see how far this SUV can actually go. Chapter 9. The Neon Desert. They drove through the heart of the Mojave Desert, where the heat ripples off the asphalt like a liquid. By the time they reached the border of Nevada, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple. Then, like a mirage in the sand, the lights appeared, Las Vegas. Are we stopping? Sarah asked, her eyes reflecting the glowing neon signs. Just for a meal and some sleep, Mark replied. But let's avoid the casinos. I've had enough gambling for 1 week. They found a retro diner off the main strip that looked like it hadn't changed since 1960. Over cheeseburgers and thick chocolate shakes, they mapped out the final leg of their journey. They weren't just tourists anymore, they were travelers. Chapter 10. The Giant Sentinels. Leaving the desert behind, they crossed into California. The air changed instantly, turning cool and damp as they entered the Sequoia National Park. Mark felt like they had entered another planet. The trees were so massive that their SUV looked like a toy parked at their base. These trees have been here for thousands of years, Sarah whispered, touching the thick, reddish bark of a sequoia. They've seen everything. Walking through the forest, Mark felt small, but in a good way. His problems, the missed emails, the monthly reports, the office politics, felt insignificant compared to the lifespan of a tree that was alive during the Roman Empire. He took a deep breath of the pine-scented air and felt his lungs truly expand for the first time in years. Chapter 11. The Golden Gate. 2 days later, they crested a hill, and there it was, the Pacific Ocean. The water was a brilliant, crashing blue. They drove across the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco, the fog rolling over the orange towers like a soft blanket. They parked the car at a pier and walked down to the water's edge. Mark pulled his laptop out of his bag, not to work, but to finally write his resignation letter. "You doing it?" Sarah asked, leaning against the railing. Mark didn't hesitate. He hit send. "Done. I'm officially a free man." Chapter 12. The road never ends. As they sat on the pier watching the sea lions, Mark realized that the end of this road trip was actually the start of something else. He didn't have a plan, a house in the city, or a steady paycheck anymore, but he had something better, clarity. "So," Sarah said, pulling a new map out of the glove box. "The Pacific Coast Highway goes all the way up to Oregon and Washington. They say the forests up there are even greener." Mark took the keys and started the engine. The old SUV hummed, ready for more. "Then why are we still standing here? Let's keep moving." Chapter 13. The Emerald Coast. The drive north from San Francisco was unlike anything they had ever experienced. They hopped onto the Pacific Coast Highway, also known as the PCH. To their left was a sheer drop into the crashing waves of the Pacific, to their right were lush, fog-covered mountains. "It's so green it almost hurts my eyes," Mark said, leaning forward to see through the mist. They crossed the border into Oregon, where the rugged coastline was dotted with sea stacks, huge pillars of rock rising out of the ocean. They stopped at a secluded beach where the sand was dark and the air smelled intensely of salt and wet cedar. Mark didn't check his phone once. He didn't care about the time. He was finally living in the now. Chapter 14. The Coffee Shop Revelation. In a small, rainy town called Astoria, they found a cozy coffee shop filled with local artists and fishermen. While Sarah was busy capturing the moody light with her camera, Mark struck up a conversation with the owner, an older woman named Martha. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind, son," Martha said, sliding a steaming mug of local roast across the counter. Mark told her about the marketing job, the leap of faith, and the long road behind them. Martha listened, nodding slowly. "Most people spend their lives building a cage and then wonder why they can't fly," she said. "You just opened the door. Don't be afraid of the sky." That night, Mark started drafting a plan. He realized he didn't want to stop marketing, he just wanted to market things that actually mattered. He wanted to help small businesses like Martha's tell their stories. Chapter 15. The Top of the World. Their final destination was Olympic National Park in Washington state. They hiked into the Hoh rainforest, one of the few temperate rainforests in the U.S. Moss hung from the trees like green curtains, and the silence was so heavy it felt sacred. They climbed toward a ridge that overlooked the entire peninsula. When they reached the summit, they could see the peaks of the Olympic Mountains on one side and the vast, endless ocean on the other. "We made it," Sarah said, sitting on a rock and looking at her worn-out boots. From the concrete jungle to the actual jungle. Mark looked out at the horizon. He felt a deep sense of pride. He had driven over 4,000 miles, but the biggest journey had been the one inside his own head. Chapter 16. The New Chapter. As they sat there, Mark's phone buzzed. It was an email from a small eco-tourism company in Seattle. They had seen his LinkedIn post about his journey and wanted to know if he'd be interested in a remote consulting role, helping them promote national park conservation. Mark showed the screen to Sarah. She grinned. "Looks like the road is paying you back already." Mark didn't know where he would be living in a month, or where he would sleep next week. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't worried. He knew that as long as he kept moving, kept listening, and kept his eyes open, he would always find his way. "Ready?" Mark asked. "Ready," Sarah replied. They turned back toward the trail, not as people returning to their old lives, but as people heading toward a brand new one. Chapter 17. The Sunset Reflection. The sun began to dip below the horizon of the Pacific, casting a long, golden path across the water. Mark and Sarah sat on a driftwood log, the sound of the waves providing a steady, rhythmic heartbeat to the evening. The air was chilly, but neither of them moved to leave. "You know," Mark said, breaking the comfortable silence, "back in Brooklyn, I used to measure my life by deadlines and alarm clocks. Now, I measure it by the miles we've covered and the people we've met." Sarah nodded, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "The road changes you. It strips away all the noise until you're left with just you." Chapter 18. The Final Miles. As the last bit of light faded, they walked back to the SUV. It was covered in dust from the desert and mud from the mountains, a physical record of their journey. Mark turned the key, and the engine hummed to life one more time. They didn't drive back toward the city. Instead, they headed toward a small town where they had rented a tiny cabin for the week. This wasn't the end of their travels, it was just a pit stop before the next adventure. Mark looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The tired, stressed man from Monday morning was gone. In his place was someone with a tan, a few more laugh lines, and eyes that were finally wide open. Conclusion. A message to you. And that, my friends, is where our story ends for today. Mark and Sarah's journey reminds us that life is too short to spend it waiting for the perfect moment. Sometimes, you just have to pack a bag and drive. I hope you enjoyed this practice session. As you listened to this story, you heard real American English, phrases like, hit the road, pay it forward, and leap of faith. These are the words that bring the language to life. Thank you for practicing with me. Remember, your English journey is just like Mark's road trip. It takes time, there might be a few bumps in the road, but the destination is absolutely worth it. Keep practicing, keep speaking, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Happy learning!